you looking for clever methods to address complex problems? Do you need ways to make predictions, determine probability, or minimize risks? If you do, then you're in the right place. Welcome to our podcast that we call Smart Remarks, Howarth States. Now here are your hosts, Christian Smart and Doug Howarth.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Smart Remarks, Howarth States. I'm Doug Howarth, and with me today is my co-host, Dr. Christian Smart and Eric Lofgren. Pleased to meet you fellas again. Christian, you just published your book. I had a chance to read it. Fabulous work. Let's talk a little bit about that right now. How's your book doing?
It's doing pretty well. Whatever stock Amazon had, which I figure is somewhere between 50 and 100 copies, they sold out of.
Oh, great!
And they have restocked. It's now retail price is $60, but they now have it priced just below $39, which I think they believe that, like in your demand curve analysis, Doug, it's price sensitive, so it will sell more at a lower price. So I hope that's the case. And also doing a training class based around the book, a one-day training class, and just set up my first training with a company in Huntsville, Alabama.
Oh, great!
That going to train 20 people, so they all get copies of the book as a part of that. So I don't really get any royalties out of that. I buy them for those kinds of classes. I buy them basically at my author discount and provide them in bulk, basically. So, but there's more copies of my book out there. So,
excellent. Interesting that you should say on Amazon that they dropped their price. Years ago, we did a demand curve analysis for Amazon and books, and we discovered that if the demand curve for books is pretty flat, which means that if you drop the price by a little, you get proportionally more demand. So that you should look forward to some more sales there.
Yeah, the interesting thing about book sales is that, like some natural phenomena that have extreme risk, book sales have extremely fat tails. A few authors make up the bulk of the sales. Right.
Well, we'll try to get you in that range here, sooner or later. So
there you go. Yep.
And they also have the Lindy effect, right?
What's that?
That's true.
They also have the Lindy effect, where the longer it's been out, the longer it's likely to stay out.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So hopefully your history isn't indicative, because you haven't even gotten to the halfway point, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're new to the podcast here. You're our guest. Pleased to have you on. So tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, and specifically your transition from the technical world you're an academic now, I would guess you'd call yourself, right?
Yeah, I guess it's strange thinking of myself that way, but yeah, so I started out as a cost functional. I was a consultant with Technomics for about 7 years. That was straight up my first job right out of undergraduate. And so I landed doing cost estimating. Primarily, that was my job function. And I started at OSD Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, which is kind of like the policy setting shop. And they do a lot of the independent cost estimates. Reported cost estimates for major system end items. And also a big chunk of that job was helping to manage and administer the cost assessment data enterprise. So that houses a lot of the data that whenever the government goes out and does a major systems contract, they need data, cost data at the lower levels through the work breakdown structure to gain insight onto how much cost goes to different parts of the system, the airframe versus systems engineering and all that kind of stuff. So we would collect the data, and actually we did a big policy revamp recently. So the cost data reports that we got in the Department of Defense were basically designed in 1973, 1966. But like that was around the area when we got the contractor cost data report, and is basically the exact same format. When you look at these old ones, you're looking at the exact same thing that the contractors were submitting today. For instead of submitting PDFs, they were submitting Excel sheets with these like standard tables in them. And we'd be collecting them and going through this process of like converting it into readable format and putting them into a database. And the whole system was trying to move over to be like, all right, let's collect the cost as the contractors more or less collect it. And then we can try to do the best we can on the back end, forcing them to take all this time to kind of like force fit it into these government formats. So I spent a lot of time going through the contractor business systems to try to figure that part out as well. It's very integrated with the earned value management systems, of course, as well as on the other side, the financial data systems, because it's not just like how much cost went to a component. It's also what kinds of labor and overhead rates, right? So
Sure.
a lot of my time was spent there. And so actually, one of the interesting things, I guess, which led me to leave that area of consulting and cost estimating was, I don't think this is the whole story, but like a part of it was I started doing some analysis for how to use inflation and escalation in cost analysis, right? So a lot of times there wasn't really clear guidance. Adjust for inflation, right? It was kind of like the standard motto. So people might go back, let's just say I'm estimating aircraft. I'll go back and look at, let's say, F-22s and F-117s, and then maybe some non-stealth models to go estimate the next F-35, let's just say. And then the question is, well, how do I adjust those over time? And a lot of people were using inflation, just 2%, but people were recognizing, oh, of course, aircraft, labor rates are growing faster than inflation, and so are the material inputs to that. So, we have to adjust not for inflation, but something greater than inflation. So we're getting back to something more or less of the real resource inputs into what went into those programs, so we can estimate the future. And so I was working on this, and we're looking at, what are all the ways, what are the correct indexes to use to do these types of adjustments, and how should they be used? Because you're not going to use them necessarily the same in a learning curve versus a cost estimating relationship and the like. So we kind of put that down, and, I guess as a young person, right, I was kind of thinking there, it's like, man, well, aren't we just baking in, why were the escalation rates higher than inflation? Aren't we just baking in poor decisions from the past into the future, right? And this kind of, I mean, everybody's thought about this that has seen the will cost estimates. There's been a should cost that go along with will costs throughout its history, right? So we're always thinking, well, that's what had happened in the past, but we want to be better, right? So we're going to go in there and really scrutinize costs and get costs down and get the should cost and all that kind of stuff. I guess with this escalation, I was just considering aren't we baking in, isn't this a self-fulfilling prophecy? And a very smart lieutenant colonel at the time, who's kind of leading the project, he sat me down. He's like, look, when I was a young lieutenant, I remember when I thought everything was messed up, right? Well, you'll find out that, there's reasons for why we do these things, right? And so that kind of got my intellectual curiosity. I was like, you know what? I don't even understand where this whole thing came from. So I just went in, read everything about the history, and then coming at it with a historical view and with my own biases towards, classical liberalism in terms of market orientedness, as well as looking at a complex adaptive systems view. I just came to the conclusion that, well, whoa, look, this system built in the 60s had a set of assumptions that radically diverged how we do cost management, but also defense management more generally from how we did that back in the 50s and 60s. And so we took this big radical branch off of the main line of how defense acquisitions used to be done. And so I started investigating that and started to think, well, potentially the way we used to handle defense acquisitions allowed for more complexity. It was more of a complex system process than what we're looking at now, which presumes a world where analysis can essentially render risk and uncertainty obsolete. So we can, through analysis, minimize uncertainties and maximize or optimize what the portfolio might be. And so I think of these two kind of strands, and I'm kind of more of the old way. And so I kind of left more research on the history of acquisition and of course, start doing some public advocacy for changing the budgeting process. So I'll stop rambling there and let you guys interject.
Well,
that's good. That's good insight about inflation. And I always when I found MDA, whenever you would do inflation on estimates until you had a contract in place, and then from that point, you would basically have an agreement in the contract that would account for escalation, called the forward rate pricing agreement. And And those rates were always higher than the overall inflation, like, sometimes double.
Yeah, and having read your book, Christian, and bringing back to what Eric's saying here, I remember in your book the point that you made that we used to see all the time at Lockheed is that older programs, 60s and before, didn't have much in the way of software, and of course, software has increased dramatically in the last half century. And because it has, and because the properties of software are such that there's a diseconomy of scale. There's more software that has to talk to more software. And so the exponents on those things are uniformly greater than 1. And that means that as you start to get things really complicated, you're getting to the point where at a certain point, all the money in the world would take all the money in the world to make the most complicated system. And it almost did that with the F-35. I think the F-35 had something on the order of 25 million lines of code.
Yes, things are getting increasingly sophisticated. Software is increasingly a part of everything, even roads. You can do a quick internet search and it'll show you that they're embedding sensors in roads now. So there's even software on the streets when you drive. You think that's the simplest thing you can think of is just a road you drive on, but it's becoming increasingly sophisticated.
Yeah, but I would also caution you that as we get more advanced in time, we have the tools have to manage that complexity also increase. So it's not necessarily when I look at a JSF and 25 million lines of code, that is not a proxy for me for how complex or how well functioning the system is, right? Like when I look at Google, like some of the like Amazon's backend or Google's backend, those are very complicated systems, right? But they arrived at them in a very different way, right?
Yes.
Planning that and they're going on a 10-year development cycle and then fixing upon fixing, they took a very different approach. And so I think some of the aspect of where I'm coming from is also, look, back in the 50s, Ford and GM, they were doing this very waterfall process, and that's how they did things, right? And so it was natural for the Department of Defense to start picking that up, right? McNamara was a longtime comptroller, but then he just became president for about a week before he was tapped. And then he brought those systems in and he implemented them. But what happened? The American auto manufacturers started losing terribly to the Japanese who were doing things in a very different way. And now American industry has started to catch up to that, not just in lean manufacturing, but when you think about like lean manufacturing and Six Sigma, that's really not like in my mind, an assembly line manufacturing thing. It's almost like it's like a business culture and a business process that almost looks in its development more like a software because it's an intangible asset development. And so as American companies started to move back away from that waterfall process, now the Department of Defense is stuck in the waterfall and industry has moved on to something new that allows it to handle greater levels of complexity in my mind. And so I guess some of the question is, looking today, how much goodness in what the department has today with the waterfall systems, what do we need to keep from that? And what do we need to learn from the new methods and how industry has shifted? Because we can't just keep, putting a bright wall between the defense sector and the commercial sector, and more the challenge, allowing those companies to do business with the Department of Defense.
Eric, maybe you could explain for our listeners and our viewers what you mean by the waterfall technique. Maybe you could explain that for them.
Yeah, I mean, the waterfall technique is a pretty classic concept. I think when we talk about waterfall, it first kind of came from a paper from the 70s where he was outlining software development. And he had this nice, and it literally looked like a waterfall because it stopped, like you start at the requirement at the top, that goes into, initial design, detailed design, code and unit tests, right? And then you start to deploy that to assurance, and then it kind of feeds back into itself. So you go through the whole development cycle, you release it, and then you start over again. You can even translate that into hardware because that's how a lot of our systems are done on the hardware front too, right? We write a requirement. What are the specifications I need it to accomplish? The size, weight, power, the range, all that kind of stuff. And then just you design a system from that, basically knowing what the physical laws are that are out there, and then connecting those mathematical rules to arrive at like a correct engineering specification. And because I know the natural laws, and because I can retrace my steps with mathematics, I know it's internally consistent and will function in the real world, hopefully. It's just the problem with that is once I go through all those years to create the requirement and then build it and see if it works and test it, I'm losing out on that feedback effect because all of the knowledge had to be assumed up front. So if I'm building something that's very well known, I'm building just another bridge, that model works very well. And it's a good idea to minimize your uncertainty and risk through that planning process. But I think when you get to more complicated systems where you don't necessarily know what the technical feasibility is or the environmental or user feedback will be, how it will be used, you need to kind of get into more of a do loop where I try something out, I do something minimal, get the biggest requirement. What is the thing that has to get done? What's the minimum that I can put out? And then field that, test that, get the feedback, and start adding capabilities in an incremental way where your development stack looks like your production stack. So I can kind of keep pushing that out in an iterative way and grow my capability. And we did this back in the 50s, right? Like,
sure.
The B-52 was an exemplary example. When they started out, it was a 6-engine turboprop, right? And then over time, it morphed into an 8 turbojet engine swept wing design based on the B-47. But they had several design iterations. And then even after they had the B-52A that came out, they only serviced that for a couple of years and retired it because it didn't have all the capability. And then very quickly through the 50s, you saw them go from the A, B, C, D models all the way to the H. And this H model, and it's just awesome, right? And we're expecting to fly that thing out until 2040 when the last one was built in like 1962. So we used to know what Agile meant. Maybe we lost that thread, but that's kind of my explanation there.
Well, I think
similar to your conversation we had with your friend Paul and colleague Belavacqua. About it's at Skunkworks.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where the one miracle per program.
Yes, one miracle per program. And I think the other thing you're getting at there too, Eric, is that in a huge waterfall, you've only got maybe you've started with an assumption you want to keep moving downstream until you hit something. Whereas there's two things going on here. One is that some activities, as Christian points out in his book, in the scheduling standpoint, is that some activities have to run in parallel with other activities. Yeah, that's especially true in developing new technologies. And so a true waterfall schedule doesn't really take that into effect. It likes to go sequentially. And then the second thing is that there's more iteration if you do things in smaller bites. It lets you get smaller bites of the elephant, if you will, as you go downstream. I guess that's what you're getting at there, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess it's not just that. There was a great article from Mecklin and Methsine from 1958 from Rand, and they kind of outlined a lot of the problems of waterfall. They actually kind of envisioned a lot of the stuff from the 50s is very good, and I think it just got lost. But with respect to whenever you try to fully schedule a program or a development project out, not only are you're potentially locking in a suboptimal plan, right? But when you have that plan, it narrows your blinders into only those opportunities that meet that plan, right? So I'm missing out on a whole bunch of other opportunities that could have come around, but I didn't harness them, and they could have been a better way to pivot. And you hear this a lot from like startups, and people are even talking about defense programs in that kind of way, but that they need to be able to recognize where they are and pivot when necessary. And when you try to, let's just say you did a whole schedule of a program, once you learn an assumption's wrong, well, now you have rework, and all of that effort was for naught, right? So there's a lot of problems with waterfall in terms of just putting your blinders on, and it kind of forces you to only do things that were in the plan that you can measure against. And then when you get to integration, let's just say, because like what you said, I have multiple parallel paths on here. well, the point of that was this is really complex, so we need a fully planned structure of how this whole thing integrates. But then if I run into a problem on one subsystem, right, the only solutions that I can put forward are things that work to that integrative plan. So that severely limits my creativity to create a solution set. And then what happens there is what happens with the critical path, right? You just throw more and more management pressure on this thing and more money to fix it because everything else is already going. And if there's a change to that, then the whole thing is for naught and you just wasted a whole bunch of money.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Christian's book is all about the risks that are entailed when people don't fully plan for a variety of effects. Christian, I especially liked your discussion about the no free lunch and the portfolio effects and how we should have different methods of planning. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that as it relates back to what Eric's talking about.
Yeah. So the no free lunch idea is that when you look at portfolio projects, it's not automatically the case that risk goes down. It depends on how you measure risk. If you add in additional projects, and risk may not go down that much when you add in new projects, depending on the characteristics of the programs you're looking at. So, projects and program managers often try to fund to relatively low levels in the hopes that the other projects in the portfolio in an organization will wind up offsetting that risk. But that's not the case. You have to do full up, and there's no way out of doing a full up portfolio analysis, which is not that hard to do. We know how to do it. It's not really that expensive or time consuming. We know how to do portfolio analysis, do a full up portfolio risk and look at the total portfolio risk to an organization, not just relying on a hope for portfolio effect or benefits from diversification. Because it's, when you look at, you go and talk to a financial advisor, he's going to, he or she's going to want you to diversify into a variety of stocks and bonds and have some mix of stocks and bonds and, a variety of different things. But the difference between investing and in that arena and investing in projects and planning is there's relatively limited upside. You get some sort of tangible product. You have some value that you may or may not be able to fully measure. National security and increase in national security, how do you measure that? But there's quite a bit of downside in terms of cost growth and schedule days. So
I would like to actually push back on that because in my view,
Sure.
The benefits actually does have an asymmetric upside, right? Because let's just say I've planned. See, here's one of my issues with the waterfall process, right? Because you get in kind of like a paradox do loop in your thinking. Is I need to create a requirement that will be successful and stable throughout the acquisition, but then the problem becomes I have to only have high TRL stuff, so I can't really explore at scale the things that are revolutionary. Now,
Eric, you might want to explain what TRL is for our listeners. Not everybody's going to know that.
Yeah, it's the technology readiness level. So it's basically a scaling of, where is this technology in terms of its maturity to be, tested in a realistic environment or integrated onto a platform and all that kind of stuff. So I think one of the things, there was a great quote from a physicist back in the 50s who was just like, look, it is the most unlikely things that are going to give us the biggest benefit, because basically when we go through this requirements process, right, I can only do something that I kind of know exactly what it is. So I can estimate the cost and I can estimate the requirements and I know what the TRL is, right? But that means I'm basically tethered to a legacy solution and a legacy way of thinking about things. And so I think that closes off the door. So now through that requirements process, I can't say I want like the biggest and best thing, right? Like no one in 1940 or 1939 before Otto Hahn discovered fission, right? It would have been absurd for someone to say, I have a requirement for a bomb that can level a city, right? It would just be absurd. But then it turned out that fission provided that the technical path to kind of go get there. And so it turns out, I would say that the benefit side of projects are 10x, 100x, 1000x potential returns, but it's sometimes our desire for waterfalliness that is the most likely to close off those avenues. So now we're stuck in this kind of limited benefit, but potentially like the bigger asymmetry is the negatives on the cost and schedule rather than the potential revolutionary changes from performance, being able to enter that kind of.
Well, I have two points here. One going back to what Christian was saying, and one addressing you, Eric. First of all, Christian, when it comes to risk and talk about portfolio analysis, the assumption you've made, and the great thing about, ladies and gentlemen, the great thing about working with government people is that government people, I say this as working with the government for 3 decades plus, and being on my own now for nearly a decade. The great thing about government people is that they're all vetted. They have to get security clearances. And so you're dealing with people that by and large are quite a bit more honest. And so, Christian, when you talk about risk in, say, a NASA portfolio, you're talking about people that are honest brokers. And so if we want to go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and you talked about portfolios, well, the portfolios that, I think for our listeners, if you wanted to see how they went about it, you could either read The Big Short or see the movie on it, or both. And what happened there is the agencies that reviewed portfolios, Standard & Poor's and Moody's, were assigning a value to the portfolio that didn't match the true portfolio risk. And that led to a whole bunch of, well, it led to the financial crisis of 2008. So that's what I wanted to say about your stuff. And then, Eric, about your stuff, when you talk about the big breakthroughs. Now, what's interesting in most markets have what we could term as a flat demand curve, which for those of you who study such things, that would mean if it's got an exponent greater than -1. And for example, the fighter bomber attack aircraft market has one that's about 0.-6, meaning it's pretty flat. But every once in a while, so that restricts how many fighter, bomber, and attack aircraft we can have, and we'll show you that here in a little bit. But what's fascinating about the breakthroughs that can happen is having worked at the Skunk Works for decades, I can tell you that when people came up with stealth, it led to a couple of really phenomenal things. One that you've probably seen, and one you may not have. The first Gulf War, where the F-117s came in, and they just basically came in stealthily, unseen, and basically had their way with the entire Iraqi defense, and basically created a way for us to win that war in a few weeks. And then more recently, the F-22, with its stealth, it has entered a bunch of combat games. They typically call these things red flag events. And what usually happens in such events is the F-22, which is our premier fighter now, can go against our F-15, which was our premier fighter. Both sides enter the air. The F-22 spots the F-15 before the F-15 even knows the F-22 is there, and destroys all of them automatically. And as one F-22 pilot said, it's like clubbing baby seals. So there are certain advantages, certain new technologies that can put you leaps and bounds against the competition. So that's an interesting observation that you made there, right? So
yeah, that's a good point, Eric. But I guess the question is, how do you incorporate that in your planning process? That's those are some things that are somewhat radical in terms of their uncertainty. In this case, radical opportunities, radical benefits. But how do how would you incorporate that in your planning process?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think a lot of times looking back, these things look obvious, but then looking forward, they look incredibly indeterminate and very personal from whoever's like advocating for these things. So I tend to believe that you almost have to let some people use their own money, like the classic like startup guys, like I'm just finding my own money, and one guy that believes in me. So I mean, what does that look like in the Department of Defense? I think there needs to be more funding to smaller projects that are kind of have like a long-term view, that are just like incrementally tinkering on things. And I think we do this in the labs, but kind of scaling that a little bit more. But I think the big part of how you actually get some of those things, and I think the labs have been very successful at that kind of tinkering and discovery. And it's just like, well, how do we bring that faster, right? Like instead of DARPA coming up with, robotics and AI and whatever, the internet, and then it just goes out into the commercial industry, they figure out how to make it work. And then once it becomes normal, it comes back into the government. How do we work that a little bit better? And I think a lot of that has to do with the flexibility to try things out on a small scale and then make trade-offs in real time. So I guess from a portfolio view, the way that I would approach it is is for you, when you're thinking about a portfolio of projects, to consider Oliver Williamson's discussions in the 60s about task partitioning, right? So like big monolithic programs that are just waterfall in nature, and now we enter them into a portfolio, but rather we partition those tasks both across component and across time. And now through that lens, you might have a different view of risk, and you might have a different view of how these things kind of come together, because you might want to, instead of, creating everything brand new for a joint strike fighter and everything's exquisitely integrated, you might want to start with an ecosystem of independently advancing subsystems. And we used to see this, right? Like General Electric used to develop on its own dollar a family of different engines, and then they would wait until the government came out with a requirement and they'd be able to respond. And then the development contract would cover some of those costs, but not all of those costs. And a lot of the costs that actually did get covered were in production and sustainment. But then once we moved to this new waterfall budgeting process that we have, GE just had to abandon that, right? And more or less the flavor of how things were done back in that time. And if we can kind of, break those things apart and move incrementally, I think that's just one aspect of thinking about risk that complements, I think, rather than, is a substitute for the way you were presenting it.
Well, if I can interject something there, Christian, when getting back to say something like stealth and trying to measure the value of it, what's big in our techniques here is trying to separate cost, which I think everybody understands, from value and demand, and then resulting profits. And so value in our vernacular is how many dollars somebody or a group of somebodies have thrown at a certain product or a feature of a product. So getting back to stealth, how you could have modeled it is you could have modeled it by using some sort of lab technique where you say, well, what would happen if, and you can give this to a computer model, what would happen if the average signature of an aircraft was 1/10 of what it is now? And then how many planes would come through? And you could maybe model to say, okay, well, more than half of the planes would come through. What if it was 1/100th? And then you'd have a different model, and 1,000. And so eventually you could model that in the lab. And then what you could do is that after you build OF-117 and you've captured a signature, which would be, of course, a classified number, but if you're the government, you would have these classified numbers. You can see what additional benefit somebody has placed on signature. That number would actually come through for you. The same kind of stuff would happen in the commercial market. So somebody would ask me, well, Doug, doing value analysis, how would you come up with a new product form like a cell phone? I said, well, is a cell phone a completely new product form? Let's think about what exists before that. They had car phones before they had cell phones. They were very elaborate. They're very big, but they had them. Before they had car phones, they had walkie-talkies. Before they had walkie-talkies, they had smoke signals. If you cruise down the Rhine and you hop off at a castle and you go up this castle and you see, you're noticing the kind of construction that's in the castle, and you look over to one side and you see a tower that looks like that, and it's a couple miles away, and you see another tower that looks like that some more miles away, and you see another one in the distance that looks like that still. And then you say to your tour guide, well, were they all part of the same kingdom here? And they go, yes, those were the warning towers. Well, those are effectively cell towers. Very expensive cell towers that did one thing. They just warned you that bad people are coming. So the point would be is that markets will give, if you can dig deep enough, markets will give you the data that actually lets you see what's going to happen in advance. And so one of the big premises that we have here is that demand is much different than cost. And what many people don't understand is that demand curves do apply to the government. And so my most recent paper that I had at ICEA was, ICEA is the cost group to which all three of us belong, pointed out that the chance for the B-21 bomber to make the full complement of vehicles that they want to have exists. There's a chance it's going to exist, but it's about 1 in a billion. And why is that? That's because the demand curve for bombers is very flat. That's this red surface here is showing you that every one of these dots is a price quantity combination for fighter bomber attack aircraft that exist in the inventory right now. And what you can notice is that along the limit, which we call the demand frontier, along the limit, all those points are very highly correlated. So much so that if you try to make 100 units at a price that's well above the line, that limit that is, the chance of you making that falls off as you go away from the line. And so that's something that's hasn't been well understood by the market, but it's a function of the fact that the Air Force or the Navy or the Marine Corps that buys these aircraft gets its funding from Congress, and Congress behaves in a way in which those service branches don't fully understand, which is to say they have limits. And they act over time. This is 60 years worth of data. Over time, they act pretty consistently. And that's something we need to take into account.
That's a good point, Doug. Hey, I got a question for you, Eric. So in terms of, so here's one system that's currently in development, hypersonics. What are your thoughts on the agile approach for hypersonics, and how can we develop hypersonics faster? Because that's an area where we are falling behind both China and Russia in development and fielding of those systems.
Yeah, so on the hypersonics front, it's funny because we had the Navajo supersonic cruise missile. It was supposed to go like Mach 3 that was being developed in the 1950s. And it was pretty interesting that, Vannevar Bush and all these big figures, all the experts at the time after World War II thought, oh, well, we'll have like a supersonic, something almost like a hypersonic cruise missile, much easier than a ballistic missile, right? So everyone, when all the budgets down after World War II, like 27 projects went to 2, and those were both cruise missiles, one which was the Snark, which was subsonic, and the other one which was supersonic, and the experts were just completely wrong on that. But there was actually a lot of very interesting things that were being developed at the time. And Edward Teller, who of course was the father of the hydrogen bomb, he said that hypersonic ramjet engine that was canceled by McNamara in 1962 was essentially the biggest disaster since the decision not to develop the ballistic missile after World War II, right? And I was just, one of my theories here is just like those guys back then, they just did things differently, right? They were just more willing to take risks and try things out and do things in an experimental fashion, even to the extent where you have interns at these companies like fabricating and designing their own things and getting them into tests. And they're interns. It's just like unfathomable to kind of almost think of it like that these ways, or these days. But so going to today, right, we took our foot off the pedal. And one of the things that happened was weapon systems are all end items, right? So I budget to a hypersonic missile because I have a requirement for that missile. Actually, in the 90s, there was no requirement, right, for a hypersonic missile. So they just didn't do it. and the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board was actually asking, hey, can we get some hypersonic wind tunnels so we can understand these things? Because the resonances and all the difficulties with prediction of hypersonic flow is just too challenging. We don't have the computer models. And even today, like you've been hearing about some advances in that, but I don't think that there's necessarily a way to perfectly calculate those interactions other than experimentally. So the Air Force never actually built the hypersonic wind tunnels at the scale that were needed to provide this. And now it's a priority, right? So hey, how do we use this modular agile approach to go after this? Well, first, there should have been investment into enabling tools all the time around, because we can't just think of, oh, I'm going to budget for a hypersonic vehicle, right? And then I'll a weapon system prime, and then through their overhead rates and other structures, or potentially I just buy the tooling on their CLINs, right? Like then I will get to the capital that enables this. No, you gotta go to the capital first. like that's where you got to start, because that allows you to figure out what the correct design was going to be in the first place. So the first thing I would have said was, look, you needed to start at that level, right? The capital equipment level, and fund those as dedicated programs in of themselves. Probably GoCo, maybe GoGo facilities, such that you get the shared services.
So Eric, explain those acronyms to our listeners and our viewers.
Sure. GoGo is government-owned, government-operated. GoCo is government-owned, contractor-operated. So, back in the day, there used to be a lot more government facilities for these types of things. But one way you could envision it is either the government funds a government-owned kind of capital infrastructure for those hypersonic wind tunnels to help out any kind of companies or other program offices throughout the services doing this kind of work. So now you're getting some of the economies of scales and shared services out of that. You could also fund a company to go out and do that, because there's a lot of companies now that, like, if you're a startup, you can't spend $2 million on a piece of lab equipment, right? So there's these new shared service lab type companies that are popping up in your everyday life, right? There's like a tooling, like just for like hardware. And like, if I just need a table saw, I don't need to go buy it. They have like these little clubs that you can be a part of, something like that reduces barriers to entry and transaction costs. So increments. So again, like funding stream capital infrastructure to kind of go do that, lowering the barriers to entry where possible, and modularizing those contracts in such a way that, I mean, you can only do so much with a hyper example of, well, I just need the whole damn thing to work together, right? Like it's a little bit harder in that front to imagine how I could just go after like the biggest thing first, because I need it to be hypersonic, and to get somewhere accurately, I kind of have to do that all at the same time. So I think with respect to that, one of the things you want to be able to do is first, again, have those shared services, have some kind of enterprise capability, such that you can enable smaller project offices to try out different types of methods, and you're not just like focusing on the one. I hear like the Chinese have a SOD-RAM jet that's like a new type of jet, different than the scramjet or the ramjet. And it's like, are the Americans working on that? How are you diversifying your portfolio, and then using that competition? Because when we look back at the ballistic age, right, it's not just I want to modularize this contract necessarily, but it's also, can I get learning in a different way? So there's two real problems with the ballistic missile at the time, and one of the biggest one at the time was really a proven re-entry vehicle and how that would look. And it wasn't the Air Force that figured it out. It was the Army's Jupiter program that just put every different type of shape and every type of material into the blast of a rocket engine in order to see how it would act. And then they found out that no, it wasn't the blunt design that was the best for this. And then the Air Force picked that up. So that kind of competition and like the different approaches that one can learn from the other, and then there's like spillover effects. I think that's the way you want to get there, with the ability to cancel projects quickly. So funding flexibility between them in some kind of portfolio, because at some point, maybe funding's constrained and I need to merge them like they're doing now. But potentially you want to start out new small things that are like edges, right? And if it's not working, be able to just cancel it and shift the funds when it's necessary, rather than, oh, I'm going to go through a 10-year cycle to figure out how to cancel this, and then move the funds over. And poor, like exosphere kill vehicle, when they tried to cancel that, you see all the heartache there. Could you imagine like being actually nimble enough to move funds between competing projects? So I think that's kind of the fantasy world I live in.
Yeah, that flexibility would be great, because that really does hamstring programs and projects, and having to get congressional authority to try to move money around within an agency is very difficult. And it usually is done to, I mean, these are people these program managers are not dumb. They're doing it to save money or be more efficient, and but then Congress makes it very difficult.
Christian, when you're talking about
it's like pulling teeth. Yeah.
When you're talking about the hypersonic missile gap, I'm reminded of Dr. Strangelove talking about the missile gap and then the corresponding mineshaft gap that they had.
The mine shaft gap, yeah. No, have you ever? Who was the guy that? Who was the Pentagon Papers guy? He wrote a book about his experience with that, and he said that they would go out and. Shoot, he wrote a book about that not in the last few years, about how he was working on this type of technology at the time, and they would go out and they went out and watched Dr. Strangelove during the day on a break at work, and then went back to work and talked about how true to life Dr. Strangelove was.
Yeah,
this is supposed to be fiction. How they know everything we're doing?
Yeah, well, they were shocked.
Daniel Ellsberg is his name?
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
Yeah. So,
but interestingly, I know that the U.S. has been working very hard on hypersonics for decades. It's interesting, though, wondering what's going to be able to defeat it. Is it going to be a hypersonic interceptor kill vehicle, or we've been doing a lot of work lately with lasers. I mean, lasers.
That's it, right?
Yeah, lasers. Lasers are very expensive. Missile Defense Agency actually was able to developed and fielded a missile defense that was I think it was on a B-52 bomber, and flew around and fired a laser and could basically shoot down the reentry vehicles. Worked very well, but it was so extremely expensive to operate, they had to shut it down.
Well, one of the other ways that you get around it is the new force structure, right? Where if you have something closer to a mosaic warfare, you're not going to spend an expensive hypersonic missile to take out like a small autonomous blank, right? But if you put everything into these massive platforms, then it changes the calculus, and then you have to focus on how do I defeat their targeting, right? Probably if I can't stop it from coming in, how do I defeat their targeting then? Yeah,
and there's some exercise, what they call left of launch, try to shut it down before it's able to launch, right? Yeah. Yeah, but where was DARPA? I mean, from the devil's advocate side of the Defense Department, well, they fund DARPA. They have a Naval Research Lab. They've got other outfits that do this. You're supposed to be working on this kind of stuff. Where was DARPA? And I know DARPA's working hypersonics now, but where was DARPA when we should have been developing hypersonics? Was it just fell by the wayside, or?
I guess it depends on when you think we should have been developing them. If you think it's the 90s, well, potentially they were out there, getting their feet wet, forcing the drone revolution, right? And that's
right.
It's that I always just think of that as one of those things where it's like, well, for Doug, does that shift your demand? Like, is our drones and UAVs on the same demand curve, or are they a new demand curve? And when does one thing morph into another thing?
Well, interestingly, if you were to plot UAVs on this demand curve here, they're down here, and they're helping extend the demand curve. So
they're on the demand curve. They just extend it.
They're going to extend it, yeah. And I haven't captured all of them that are in here, but you take the larger ones, the MQ-9 and the MQ-1. They were down. They are included in this batch. They're right down here. Of course, this is log scaling, so that means that they're quite a ways away from the demand frontier. But initially, they formed their own demand curve. What we end up seeing, a post I just put up the other day, is that if you study the mass-produced electric car market, and I do, it started in 2009 with the Mitsubishi i-MiEV, with a single unit sold in July of 2009. And then as it morphed over time, the demand frontier for the electric cars has come up to meet and match that for gasoline-powered cars, which is fascinating. So to answer your question, I think what's going to happen is they're going to come up to meet that demand curve. Now, there's two parts to this demand curve. There's the in a curve like this, there's an upper bound, but you notice here there's also an outer bound. There's an outer bound here where nothing's no longer built. Now, UAVs are starting to increase that outer bound this way. So there's an outer and upper bound to the curve. And there's also, for manufacturers, there's a lower bound and an inner bound, which is to say you have to make a certain number to be efficient, and you have to sell a certain number per year to make it. You have to have a certain margin for the producers for him to make a go of it. And so you see this in a lot of markets. that they have bounds on all four sides. It's kind of an irregular polyhedron, but there's an upper, outer, inner, and lower bound to the market with respect to demand. And you only find that if you actually plot those points, which are retrievable usually from most markets. So that's kind of what we do.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because you think of demand as just being an upper bound, but there's actually from the producer side, there's also a lower bound because their costs are decreasing. It's not really a true upward sloping supply curve in most markets, and where you're producing things, because as you produce more, you actually are able to the costs go down per unit.
Well, as you know, Christian, we take exception to upward sloping supply curve and anything outside of a commodity. So, for example, you'd see an upward sloping supply curve in iron production or copper production, which is to say certain mines can come on board. They're the most efficient mines will always be on board. As the price goes up, the progressively less efficient mines come on, and that'll form an upward sloping supply curve. But the problem in any other market, any market for a non-commodity, is that to suppose that you have an upward sloping supply curve that somehow magically intersects the demand curve. First of all, that would mean that you only had, from classic economics, you'd have an upward sloping supply curve. There'd only be one point that would form an equilibrium. Well, clearly here, there's no equilibrium. All these are 23 points doing just fine. The other point that you would see is that if you had an upward sloping supply curve, that would mean that people got dumber as they went along. I'm adding more and it's costing me more, but we know that learning curves actually indicate that the more we build, the smarter we get. So there's at least two reasons to suggest that doesn't happen. And then the other reason is that what the people are neglecting at the same time is the value response to this, which is to say all these markets are forming a four-dimensional system. So every point on this side of the equation, this is the value side, has a corresponding point on the value side. And this is for bombers, and then this is for the Dow 30 from June of last year. So this is the Dow 30, the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Here's the demand curve for them, and here's their associated response surface. So all markets that have four or more attributes demonstrate a 4D system.
What are your two axes on the bottom?
These are return on assets, ROA, and
adjusted earnings per share.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess one of my issues here is that models tend to be for like commodities, I guess. And what happens when it's like, well, I'm in an information world and it has nothing to do, like I can just reproduce any number for the same cost. The real thing is creating more value, more attributes, and then these attributes are non-commensurable. So like on that one bomber thing, you had payload, but a bomber could have up to an unknown number of attributes that are all relevant to the value proposition, but they are unknown. But there is no way, because they're incommensurable, to collapse that into a single number for the relevant analysis. So we have to kind of reduce it to. But
the statistics indicate that you can collapse it to a single number with a bound around it, a log normal bound, to use Christian's stuff. So, for example, in bombers, right here, this is a simple model that looks at just the payload, and then it also looks at how the number of bombers falls off as you start to get them. So this is actually, these form product demand curves, but in other analyses that we've done, the bombers are the value of a bomber is a function of its payload, its range, its speed, and its stealthiness. And you can get all that stuff, and you can work out a value for it. If you're in a classified arena, that you'd need to have the stealthiness figures provided to you. But that actually does translate to a value, and that value decreases over time. And very importantly, the value of this decreases faster in the bomber, fighter, attack aircraft arena. This decreases at a faster rate than any known learning curve that's out there, which means that at a certain point, those two things are going to, let's see here, they're going to intersect. Eventually, the value of it will come to equal the cost, and at a certain point after that, the cost will exceed the value, and that's when the program stops. And you can actually derive that from the data that's out there in the market. from the government side and see what see how it's going to behave.
So here's a thought experiment. Let's say I pay a price for like a configuration of a bomber, right? And so I'm just going to pay the company, let's just say $1 billion per year, and that will, and because of information technology, let's just say like advanced manufacturing is really the bee's knees, and I kind of can produce these
bees and knees. You got to explain that to people. Sorry.
And advanced manufacturing actually can reduce the cost of production, so it looks more like software than it does like hardware, right? Because it's just ones and zeros. So I have a fixed price, I have a fixed number of units, and I'm constantly putting abilities on that through software and through other types of upgrades. Something like we see with our commercial platforms, where I just pay a subscription fee and then they're just deriving me greater and greater value. I'm just like creeping up that, which goes along with technology change and increasing total factor productivity, or whatever you want to call it. So what does, like in the world where the world is information rather than industrial goods, does this analysis, how does it still works, or how do you think about that?
Sure, it still works. There's always going to be a demand curve, and if the cost comes to exceed the incremental value, that's when the program stops. So, for example, to use your example about software, what they've done with what Microsoft has done with Windows. When you bought Windows, when I bought Windows, I'm older than you guys. When I bought Windows first, 35 years ago, whenever it first came out, it was tremendously expensive. You were paying, and you pay extra for Excel, you pay extra for PowerPoint. There wasn't any packaging. And what they were experiencing, they were at the top end of the demand curve. And so just like that happens, so the analogy to that in the physical world is that the cost of television sets has come down 97%, flat screen TVs, in 20 years. What used to cost $300 now costs less. It costs about $9.55, and that's from the last time I studied it. And so what's happening is the companies are still making money because they're dropping their price and they're going further and further along the demand curve. Now, at a certain point, you say, well, Doug, you just told me there was an outer bound to it. Well, what's the outer bound to the demand curve for computers? Well, how many people how many people are there in the world? That's kind of the answer. Is at a certain point, if you make it cheap enough, everybody in the world would have it.
The question is, what is a computer? And is that now like chips? And then what's the number of chips? And it could be an infinite number of chips
Right.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Yeah. I mean, my phone's a computer, right? So
yeah.
Exactly.
I probably paid more for my current smartphone before my discounts than I did for my last computer.
Yeah, who would have predicted that a long time ago, right?
Right. I mean, I recently bought a Samsung Galaxy S20 Plus. Now we did it. My wife's very good at watching for bargains, so we got a good deal from Walmart. I actually got it from Walmart and got like a $400 gift card, or $500 gift card. So it's dropped the $12.99 price to $7.99, but still that's $800. But before that discount, if you just went out to Verizon and bought it, it was $12.99, $1,299. That's probably $200 more than the last PC I bought.
And interestingly, when it first came out, it was several $100s higher than that. It was close to $2,000. Right. So they're already walking it down the demand curve. So that's the answer to that, is that people walk things down the demand curve to get, because the incremental prices for software, as you point out in some of your papers, Eric, the incremental price of software is close to nothing, right?
So really, the demand curve is kind of you're amortizing that fixed cost over more units. If for something like software, which has minimal, if not almost zero.
Well, again, the thing to remind ourselves of, and getting back to the color TV, and this is the thing between where the difference in procurement becomes apparent, is that when you go in to buy when I go in to buy, maybe you guys are different. When I go in to buy my cell phone, what I say to myself is, I'm looking at the cell phone and the features that it has. This is an older model of the Samsung. I look at the features that it has, the size of the screen, the memory, the battery duration, and I compare that against all other phones that are out there. And I say, what else can I get? I think this thing cost me $400 when I got it. What else can I get for $400? And I look at everything else that's cost $400, and then I decide I'm going to buy that. The one thing I never did was to ask myself, geez, I wonder what it cost these guys to make this phone. I never asked myself that question. This could have cost them $2,000 to make, $200 to make, or it could cost them $20 to make. I don't care. What I care about is the value of this phone compared to the other phones. And that's the distinction that hasn't been made fully clear to people in procurement, is that eventually at a certain point, that attribute of all markets will catch us up to all markets, including government markets. So
right. So speaking of government markets, Eric, one question I want to ask you about, and it goes back to a point you brought up earlier about GE and their sort of the innovation that they were doing kind of on their own dime behind the scenes using internal research and development money, what we call IRAD. Now that was back in like the 50s and 60s, right? So do you see as much of that today? I don't get the sense that the big contractors are doing as much today. And is that probably a function of the fact that there's less competition out there now? And are these big primes, the big five, are they less hungry than they used to be when there was more competition?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And what Doug was talking about, I think, is one of the deepest subjects that there kind of is that kind of difference between input costs and opportunity costs, and it's just really hard to wrap your mind around opportunity costs, because again, we think of, the price of an item, the value of that item is correlated with or is based on what were the input costs into that. And it's the exact opposite, right? It's the imaginings, the speculation of what the output could be that drives what the entrepreneur, what the decision maker is willing to pay for input costs to reorganize those in such a way that they create something for less costs, or they create with a new process, or they create something different that drives more value. And it's it's that shift in mindset of opportunity costs that we need to have. And to get to your question there, Christian, you cannot make those opportunity cost choices without competition, because I can look at the input cost. That doesn't tell me whether I'm getting in value. It's just like, well, they might be really inefficient just using resources terribly, right? I have to see alternative uses of those resources with incentive to make sure that they're actually trying to do it at the lower value, and then compare those alternatives to say, am I deriving value? What is the value of this thing? And that comes back to a subjective choice, because again, even for a cell phone, there's lots of attributes. I can't just say there's not going to be one phone that trumps every other phone in every attribute and is lower cost, so I can make that decision easy, right? There's going to be trade-offs like, well, do I need battery life, or do I need this kind of ease of screen use? And then the cost might be here or there, and then what does that mean? So these are inherently subjective choices. And I'd like to get back to your question, but if you guys wanted to jump in on that.
Well, I wanted to jump in on a point here that Christian raised in his book, and I didn't get from I think you were touching on it in your papers, but I didn't know how you felt about it exactly. But Christian points out that, just 8 miles from us that way, which would be, as I'm pointing here, basically to the southwest. Back in 1994, we had an event called the Northridge earthquake, and it managed to drop several overpasses into the ground, and we made for tremendous traffic snarls. And so back then, the government cleverly decided to hire a contractor and give them incentives for performing quickly, and said, well, you get this much if you stop, you finish on schedule. You get more if you finish ahead of schedule. And that bridge has been standing now for 26 years, but they finished well ahead of schedule. And the one thing I was wondering from your standpoint, Eric, is it seems like the government's very quick to penalize people, especially the U.S. government, but not so readily willing to give incentives to try to make it so that people can work better, faster, and hopefully cheaper. What's your feeling about incentives in the federal government system? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think this gets back to Christian's question about, IRAD and how they do those developments, because again, like for contractors back in that time, the government didn't pay for IRAD directly, right? Like if the contractor decided to do IRAD, internal research and development, they would only be able to get that reimbursed basically through the profits on production and sustainment contracts, right? Because now they won the system and that's kind of like their prize. And that's kind of how the game was played, right? Like I'm going to like invest more of my resources to make this the best offering so I can win that prize. And now I think it was around 1973 that they instituted the reimbursement policies where if a prime does do IRAD, they get to charge that back to the government across all their contracts as part of their general and administrative rate. So IRAD, in essence, is not a speculative venture so much as it is a profit center now because they get paid for it. It also gives them a benefit that they have this thing that they can put on the proposal and influence the proposals and get the win for the next system. And I see that as a terrible kind of way to drain out the competition because let's just say I'm a new company, right? I don't have the systems and the humongous base of existing contracts to even get that IRAD advantage where I'm negotiating all of my labor and material and all those like rates and overhead rates to charge that back as an allowable cost. So if I'm going into a competition, right, I get private funding and I got to like build out this thing myself and then bring it into competition with a prime who potentially has already sunk their own IRAD, that's reimbursed by the government, so it's paid for, right? So there's a disadvantage. Not only is the prime bigger, not only do they have access to the government, but they also get it paid for. Where the contractor needs to figure out how to get private funding, and then they're not really sure whether they're going to see that back. And so we see a big issue here. I think that the government's acquisition system definitely. Back in the 50s, you had these ecosystems of modular components that would kind of be rapidly integrated onto a project or a platform level. And that kind of kept the incentives around for people to there's always going to be something else, right? Not like the winner take all once in a decade thing. There's multiple opportunities and there's multiple programs going on. So more guys would invest their own money because if they had the best product, they would be able to get it in. But now it's like, you got to go through the waterfall. You don't get to make your own decisions. We make the decisions. You might be able to influence it at the front end. But then now everybody's competing for a fixed requirement, and it's all based on price and who has the lower price to go win that. So I think as we move into the 20th century, we're starting to see some of these companies now trying to fight back into the government. You're going to see this issue that we see with all startups and all new companies, right? They have to have their own private capital. They have to sink it into product decisions that are their own, right? So some of these companies are taking that on their own dollar for their own design choices. And then they're going to try to advance that thinking that, oh, well, I can advance these technologies and do better. I'm speculating. Again, this is the entrepreneurial spirit, right? You look at something that's monolithic or a monopoly or it's just not working that well. And you say, I can create something better for cheaper by putting these resources together in a new way. Let's just say AI or something like that, right? And so once they go do that, they have to first have all the capital to go do it. Then they have to sell it back to the government. And this is the problem area, right? I'm going to go sell it to the government. How do I price it? And as you said, Doug, the government is fine at penalizing people, but they don't have a way of really incentivizing people. So if they say, okay, you sunk $1 billion into this thing of your own money, right? And now we just have a little bit of extra development to make sure it kind of, is fielded and the force. But that's like a marginal cost. And then we want to know, okay, when you're fielding this, whether it's a unit or like a license to like put something on the machine, like what's the marginal cost? Like what is the actual cost of production for that next unit? And it's like, well, the accounting policies are such that my sunk cost in years past cannot be like charged back to specific objects in this accounting period. So there's no way for those new companies to kind of get that past stuff, reimbursed because that's exactly what you're doing that companies are doing. They need high margins on an individual sale because they're sinking all of these costs into G&A, into like enterprise tools, into research and development, into business and marketing that doesn't get, it's like spread across the entire organization. It's not identified with an individual good. And the government only wants to pay for those types of individual marginal costs. But the prime, right? Well, when they were undergoing all that R&D stuff for the new stuff, not only does the government pay them through IRAD, but they have a big portfolio of existing contracts to spread that across. So they don't have the timing consistency problem. Oh, I spent it in this period, but it's really helping out this product here in the future. So those costs should be allocated to it. And then and that should work on my pricing because everyone sees it. Well, that's just not how it works. So the primes have that other advantage where they can like over their portfolio of lots of programs and over time be able to like, you know, move these costs out and get them charged to the government. So 10% profit to a Lockheed Martin is actually really big because in that cost base is all of their overhead, everything. They get 10% like on top of what they do. Whereas like a new contractor, if they got 10% profit, that would probably be 10% profit just on like the cost of goods sold in terms of accounting or in terms of financial statements. But then they have all of these expenses that aren't getting covered. So they're like losing money for the most part. And they don't have the privilege of basically charging that all back to get, you know, higher total price, but like a lower margin, right? like, so that, I guess that's one of the issues I see there in terms of competition, in terms of timing and internal research and development, and just the ability for new contractors to kind of break in.
But now, speaking of breaking in, you know, NASA, you know, around a decade or so ago was subsidizing SpaceX
right
to develop launch vehicle capabilities, and it's worked out pretty well. SpaceX has done some really innovative things, and they're providing launches to NASA and the Air Force cheaper than they could get, you know, from traditional contractors like ULA. Should the DoD do something like that? Try to bring SpaceX into the weapons system business?
Should the DoD try to bring SpaceX into?
Yeah, in the weapons system business, try to get them some sort of, you know, help them a little bit. There's a little bit more of a hurdle in the DoD and weapons systems. It's not just the cost; it's also, you know, speaking the right language and following the right steps. Do you think that there's some value in having, you know, that entrepreneurial spirit of SpaceX kind of brought into the weapons systems arena?
Well, of course. And they are to an extent, right? Like the Army is now, I believe, contracting with SpaceX for their Starlink capability to support their Project Convergence, the kind of JADC2. And of course, the Air Force contracts with SpaceX for their space launch. But I hear that it's still pretty difficult for them, even though they have the vastly lower prices to actually, you know, break into that market still. And so I think, yeah, I mean, of course, the DoD should start to bring in SpaceX because they already have the past performance and that track record. But it's also like, how do we encourage more of that, right? Because, you know, like what's the next SpaceX, and how does the government actually, you know, allow other companies, new SpaceXs to kind of emerge from that system? And, you know, I think the way that NASA did it was quite interesting because they just had these other transaction contracts with milestones on them. So milestone payments. So it's like, they modularized that thing. And you'd say like, back then you'd probably be like, well, you know, a rocket's a pretty good example of something that needs to be like a total system, you know, integration concept. You can't modularize that. Mm-hmm. They did it, and they made these, and SpaceX is showing how, you know, agile development processes are actually doing quite well, and their ability to kind of test things out, use enterprise software tools, and just lower costs across the board is pretty amazing. So I think the way that NASA did it, they modularized that contract to say like, okay, let's go show me the next step. And then I think what NASA had there was a lot of technical competence in-house that the DoD more shed itself of in the 90s and also before, where the people in NASA were smart enough to be like, I know what the next step is and I can see success, right? It's not just cost growth to like this metric. It's like, are they showing me real progress? And so NASA didn't have to put that much money. Like if SpaceX wasn't performing, NASA could have just cut that off and stopped it off, right? And gone to the next provider and see, like, can you do it? And so maybe that's one way that you want to start seeing a lot more companies kind of get into it, where there's more technical in-house to kind of make these opportunity cost decisions more in real time through partitioned contracts, and then allow them to kind of grow. And it's just amazing that, you know, even NASA admits, right, like we could never have gotten costs down that low. And NASA spends far much more money on Boeing's SLS rocket, right, the Space Launch System. And it hasn't flown, it hasn't done anything, it still is delayed another year, I heard recently. So
yeah, and Orion, they spent over 15 years, they spent over $20 billion on Orion, and it's flown once. And they have a technical issue too that they have to go in and fix. And one of the things that they don't like to do, you know, up front is to try to, you know, pay a little bit more to design it to be able to fix it, you know, get into it. So now they've had to spend like 8 months trying to get into the guts of it to replace a PDU.
But I think that's also one of the things that we see constantly, where it's like I have multiple aspects of a mission, Orion and the launch vehicle and all of that, and then they're just, you know, they're completely not synced. And we saw that with like GPS and EOS, a lot of these satellite systems, like the ground systems and then the user equipment. They were just like, well, I got the satellites up there, and then it's going to take another 10 or 15 years before I can use code at my ground station. And like, well, you should have been working on some parts of that probably first and de-risk that, and then see where you would be successful, and then go ahead with the rest of it, rather than, you know, just like really just these synchronization problems, especially in space, were terrible.
Oh yeah, and you know, over time, you know, it's really going from, you know, Saturn to Apollo. I mean, from Saturn and Apollo to shuttle was such a radical departure. There's really no way to take an agile type of approach. And over the year, and then shuttle wound up being so expensive to operate, they really could not afford to develop a replacement until they had canceled shuttle.
Yeah, one thing that's come up in both of your guys' work that I don't know an easy way to fix is that, and this is what we lived at Lockheed, is that, you know, you try to be an honest broker as a cost estimator, and you come up with all the cost, and the first thing that'll come out of the program's manager's mouth is it's too high. I've never heard a program manager tell me that's spot on, or worse, that's too low. I mean too high, or too low rather. We need to have. They want to always take cost out of it. They always tell you that it's too high, and so what they do is they conspire to try to make the cost lower. So one thing we discovered at Lockheed was that the cost managers figured out pretty early on that many of our cost metrics are based on weight. And so you come up with a weight statement in advance of program launch. And the weight engineers are pretty sharp, you know, they know what they're doing. But then somehow magically, as the program approaches, the weights would drop. And then at program launch, they would hit their low point. And then over time, they would creep up. In fact, most of the time, either meeting or exceeding where they were at the beginning, forming basically a checkmark function. And so there's got to be some way that we can take the incentives out for program managers to fib about what the costs are going to be. Christian, I think, has done a really good approach on that, saying, look, we know what we should be costing at, what the thing should maybe cost, but we know that there's some risk associated with that. So Christian's work shows how we should allocate those risks. And interested, Eric, in what you think about how we need to move forward to try to let people be like the three of us have been and are, estimate cost with somebody basically accepting the answer, saying, you know what, your number is pretty good, we like it. How are we going to go to that point?
Yeah, I think one of the issues there, of course, is the classic should cost, will cost versus will cost. And what you're getting at is the program manager has a must cost figure.
Right.
He knows it makes this system institutionally viable, and there's a wedge in the budget that I can reasonably get if I get to the must cost figure. So he's playing the game that he has to play, and that's the institutional game that there is right now. And so I think, again, when you get to more of a modular portfolio approach, where each item is kind of smaller and then they can be traded off against each other, you potentially won't get that as much pushback. I think one of the big issues here is that the bigger and the longer a program is, like the way we do it, it's just fundamentally, it has to have more risk involved in it, right? It's just going to be like the longer it goes, the more uncertainties there are, and the more risk there's going to be. And when you take that approach, it's like, well, in order to kind of fund my risk profile, I'm going to need to be pretty high in order to get there. And the program manager is going to balk at that because he's looking at a must cost figure. And so the answer isn't, oh, well, let's just pretend to make it shorter and whatever, and we'll just get there in less cost and we'll just be innovative, right? I think that's the should cost approach. Like, oh, well, if I just scrutinize the subcontractors enough and I just pound them out and get the lowest price, and then I optimize my labor in terms of how they are working on this machine tool, I can get that at a lower cost. And that's the should cost thinking about it. And I don't necessarily agree with that one, because it presumes whoever's doing the should cost knows better than the people doing it, that like what those things and what those innovations are. So all the innovation is now like, who's doing cost analysis? Now there's the innovation is like, well, that's not really how it is, right? So I guess in my view, when you take more of a modular approach, or you're only tackling the biggest thing first, right? Like again, with the F-117, Christian and I talked about this, they took existing components and then they tried a new airframe, right? And I think the French are excellent at this too, where they just like have a base model of an aircraft and then they just evolve that into doing all sorts of amazing stuff. And it's like their Mirage was simultaneously like a fighter, and then they did it into a vertical lift fighter, and then they moved it into a bomber and a swing wing bomber, all from like the same basic design that they were going along with. And so I think you can do a lot more of that type of stuff. And the real benefit, I think, for us cost estimators is that instead of having like one massive program and you have to wait 10 years to see how it shakes out, and I have to compare that against things like 30 years ago because I need enough, data points to make some inferences. When you start taking this approach of portfolios, disaggregated families of systems, rapid integrations, and the like, the cost estimator has a lot more data, right? A lot more data to deal with, and a lot more kind of like short-term iterative and feedback stuff so that they can make those inferences much more strong. And I think the cost estimator almost has today it's a very important role to set that life cycle cost estimate, and everyone's measured to it. But the role, I think, is more incremental and nuanced in the future, because even with the life cycle approach, we still go back and do another estimate like almost yearly or whatever. We're always going back and retracing our steps, but we're not learning from it. And I think they kind of get that feedback of, I tried this thing out, I improved it, and I got more data on it. And now you can start thinking about cost models with real statistical significance, rather than I have 0 degrees of freedom and all have one, independent variable to measure.
Right. Well, gentlemen, this has been a very spirited conversation. I wish we could keep going, but some of us have other things to do, like jobs and things like that. So, Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Eric. It's been a great conversation.
And
great, you're welcome.
As always, again, ladies and gentlemen, Christian's book. Tell us one more time, Christian, the name of it, where we can find it.
Yeah, Solving for Project Risk Management. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, a few other websites. Amazon probably is a low price leader, less than $39 for the hardcover and under $37 for the Kindle version. You can find a Kindle version and a Nook version out there.
I can just tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, that Christian, if you ever watched him give a presentation, and they're fabulous, he has in this book taking some results that took him 3 and 4 pages of equations to come up with, and reduce those equations to charts that are easily grasped by anybody that's reading the book, and still very, very insightful. I really enjoyed your book, Christian. It was marvelous. So with that,
thanks,
gentlemen.
And Eric, any updates on your book, Eric, and getting your book published?
Yeah, I've been actually getting some comments from different areas, so I definitely have a big kind of rewrite that I want to do on it. But yeah, we'll see. I have one connection at a university press who pushed for me, so we'll see. Hopefully 2021 is the year of acquisition history, but it's not the most exciting book for publishers, as you can imagine, looking back at how systems were developed in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm still trying to get my book, which has been retitled Hypernomics, to out to some people. Some people want to make it a mainstream book, and I don't have mainstream media coverage just yet. So my goal is to get mainstream media coverage this next year. So that's where I'm going.
I like that. I like your rebranding there. That's a neat phrase you've coined.
Yeah, hyper meaning existing in 3 or more dimensions, like hyperspace, and then nomics from nonomy, which means an organization thing. So it's the organization of phenomena in 4 or more dimensions. And so we've seen it work for these economic phenomena. We also saw it work for COVID. So we're pretty excited about that. And so
and for cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've also been doing some stock trading with some of your ideas too.
Yeah. In fact, right now, it's not ready for release yet, but our index, last we looked, is we have 2 indices that we've created. One of them is now 10 months old. It's at 41% yield. The next nearest index behind that is the NASDAQ Composite at 29%. So 41.7 to 29.8. And the next nearest one to that is the Wilshire 5000, 11.9. Then we created another tranche September 8th, and that's as of last week, we're at 33.6%. And the next nearest outfit is, again, the NASDAQ at 16.7. Everybody else is lower than that. So far, so good. We're going to run a bunch more back tests. We're going to run thousands of back tests and see if we can refine our trading algorithm. But yeah, looks pretty good. And
great.
Just need to get myself more popular, which is the reason we're doing this, is to get our name out there, quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
Smart Remarks, Howard States, has been brought to you by Multidimensional Economic Evaluators. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@meevaluators.com. For more information on Christian, please visit his website, christianbsmart.com. And for more information on Doug, see his LinkedIn page, Douglas Howarth, or his website, doughowarth.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the right answer.